General Hospital spoilers for Friday, July 25th reveal that Lucas had always believed that blood meant something. Despite all the chaos Port Charles had thrown at him over the years, broken trust, shattered families, and the constant threat of violence and manipulation, he had held on to one anchor that seemed immovable, Carly. As his sister, Carly had been both a fierce protector and a relentless force, someone Lucas could rely on in the darkest moments. They didn't always agree, and their paths diverged many times. But that connection had endured, an unspoken contract of loyalty sealed by family history and emotional resilience. But as the truth about Marco's endangerment began to surface, that bedrock began to crack. For Lucas, Marco was more than just a patient or an innocent party. He was someone Lucas had taken personal responsibility for. A symbol of renewal after years of emotional isolation. The idea that Marco might have become a pawn in a dangerous game being orchestrated or at least allowed by Carly was not something Lucas could reconcile. At first, the signs were subtle, missed phone calls, strange encounters, cryptic warnings, but gradually, the pieces began to align in a pattern that Lucas could no longer deny. Conversations Carly had brushed off suddenly carried weight. Her protective silence, once seen as strength, now seemed like complicity. And worse, Carly's ties to Sonny. Her endless capacity to cover up his messes, appeared to once again be seeping into the lives of those who had nothing to do with the Corinthos Empire. Lucas confronted the possibility that Carly knew more than she was letting on. Maybe she hadn't put Marco in danger directly, but if she had withheld information that could have saved him. If she had prioritized Sonny or Jocelyn or anyone else over a young man who trusted Lucas, then her guilt was undeniable. The tension between them grew silent and suffocating. Carly, for all her emotional volatility, refused to offer a straight answer. She insisted that there were things Lucas simply didn't understand, that the situation was bigger than he realized. That Marco was fine now. But Lucas didn't want vague reassurances, he wanted truth. And Carly, whether out of fear or arrogance or self-preservation, refused to give it. That refusal was the final blow. Lucas realized that Carly had made her choice long ago. It wasn't that she didn't love him, but she loved her secrets more. She loved her control. Her ability to protect certain people at all costs, and in that obsessive need to protect her circle, she had let someone else suffer. And so Lucas did what he once thought unthinkable. He cut the cord. Not in a fit of rage or a storm of accusations, but in cold, deliberate silence. He stopped answering calls. He pulled back from family functions. He told the people closest to him that Carly's place in his life was no longer guaranteed by blood. For Lucas, the aftermath was not relief but mourning. He didn't hate Carly, but he could no longer trust her. And in Port Charles, where trust was currency, that decision sent ripples through every social and familial circle. Bobby was devastated. Michael was caught in the middle. Even Sonny, often silent when it came to internal family matters, began asking questions. But Lucas stood firm. He needed to draw a line, not for revenge, but for self-preservation. What hurt the most was Carly's inability to see why this mattered. She treated his reaction as betrayal, not realizing that the true betrayal had been hers all along. She saw Lucas's decision not as pain but as punishment. And in her efforts to reframe the story, she failed to acknowledge the fundamental truth: Lucas was done being silent. He was done watching the people he cared about suffer because someone else decided what secrets were too dangerous to share. Marco deserved better. Lucas deserved better. In time, the full truth about Marco's situation may emerge. Maybe Carly knew more than she admitted. Maybe she had tried to intervene but had been blocked by forces more powerful than her. Maybe, in her heart, she truly thought she was doing the right thing. But none of that changed the outcome. The damage was done. And Lucas's decision to sever ties wasn't about punishment, it was about clarity. About no longer living in a fog of half-truths and manipulated loyalties. The pain will linger. Family wounds always do. But for Lucas, this was necessary. A painful, irreversible step toward healing, not just for himself, but for those who still believe in truth, in transparency, and in choosing what's right over what's easy. Carly had lost more than a brother that day. She lost the last person who still believed she could change. And in Port Charles, where every secret eventually comes to light, Lucas's choice might be the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Ava had long believed herself immune to the illusions of love. After surviving betrayals, losses, and layers of personal reinvention in Port Charles, she had crafted a sharp, controlled existence that left little room for vulnerability. But then came Cody, charming, affable, and somehow always at the right place at the right time. His presence had a certain disarming quality, one that caused Ava to question the walls she had so meticulously built. He didn't push. He lingered. He didn't demand, he offered. And when he finally professed that he saw something real between them, it caught her off guard, not because no one had ever said such things before, but because this time, she found herself almost wanting to believe it. Almost. The word echoed in her mind like a warning. Almost was dangerous. Almost meant that something wasn't fully real. And as Ava examined the context of Cody's sudden interest, she couldn't help but grow suspicious. It wasn't that Cody hadn't been kind, he had. And it wasn't that she didn't feel something stirring in herself when he looked at her with a tenderness that felt unforced. But the world Ava lived in didn't reward impulsive trust. And the speed at which this love had formed was unnerving. Just days before, Cody had seemed preoccupied with his own issues, his own entanglements. Then, without warning, his focus shifted entirely to her, and not just with casual flirtation but with declarations of serious intent. It was flattering, yes. But it was also unsettling. Ava knew the signs of a con. She had used them herself when it served her purposes in the past. A carefully placed compliment, an instinct for reading vulnerabilities. An ability to echo back what someone needed to hear at just the right moment, these were skills she had mastered. And now, as Cody wrapped himself in a cloak of sincerity and offered her what looked like affection, Ava saw flickers of those same tactics in his eyes. Was he being honest? Or was he mirroring what he thought she wanted? The distinction mattered, because Ava had no intention of becoming someone's pawn again. As she mulled over the timeline of events, more questions surfaced. Why now? Why her? Why so quickly? Cody had been around Port Charles for a while, but their interactions had only recently intensified. She had been dealing with other issues, family tensions, the lingering effects of past crimes and compromises, and the need to keep one step ahead of those who would love to see her fall. Amid all that, Cody's arrival into her orbit with promises of something pure felt not only improbable but suspicious. It wasn't as though she hadn't been in the spotlight. She had enemies. She had secrets. And the more she thought about it, the more she wondered whether Cody had been sent, or if he had come of his own accord, sensing an opportunity masked as affection. Still, Ava wasn't someone who panicked easily. Her style was to observe, to collect information, to make people believe they were winning until she was ready to strike. So she didn't push Cody away immediately. She allowed the relationship to simmer, letting his comfort with her grow. She asked subtle questions, observed his reactions, compared his words against what she knew of him through others. And in that quiet examination, she began to spot fractures. Cody deflected certain topics. He stumbled when pressed about past allegiances. There were moments of tension behind his eyes that didn't align with his easy smiles. Ava saw it all, noted every inconsistency, and tucked the information away like cards in a stacked deck. But there was another problem. Ava's suspicion didn't silence the emotional pull she felt. Somewhere deep inside her, a voice, smaller, softer, whispered that maybe Cody truly meant what he said. Maybe he saw in her what no one else did. Maybe, despite the chaos that surrounded them, he was genuinely reaching out with hope and desire. That voice terrified her more than any betrayal ever could, because it signaled something she hadn't felt in years, the potential for true vulnerability. And vulnerability was weakness. To protect herself, Ava began creating distance. Not with overt rejection, but with careful pacing. She delayed responses, turned casual moments into measured ones. And challenged Cody to prove himself in small, almost invisible ways. And yet, he remained. He didn't lash out. He didn't grow frustrated. He simply waited. That, more than anything, unnerved her. Because men who waited were usually men with an agenda. And Ava couldn't afford to be wrong, not again. The turning point came one evening when Cody, unaware that Ava had been following a trail of her own, made a comment that contradicted a detail she had verified earlier through another source. It wasn't a huge lie. But it was enough to confirm what Ava had feared all along. Something about Cody's motives wasn't clean. She didn't confront him outright, not yet. But in that moment, the tender future he had painted began to blur into something darker. Was he working for someone? Was he digging for leverage? Was this all a game? Ava had faced worse, of course. But the difference now was that she had opened herself, even slightly, to the possibility of a new beginning, and that crack in her armor could be exploited by the wrong person. She wasn't heartbroken. She was furious. Furious that she had almost believed, furious that someone had dared to try and manipulate her again, and most of all, furious at herself for wanting any of it to be real. Now, Ava was recalibrating. Cody remained unaware of how much she had seen, how much she knew. But that wouldn't last. Ava had already begun setting traps of her own, not out of revenge, but for clarity. If Cody was truly a danger, she would neutralize him. If he was merely lost, a man grasping at connection in a dangerous world, she might reconsider her judgment. But one thing was clear, love, or whatever Cody thought he was offering, was no longer enough. Ava needed truth. And in Port Charles, truth was the rarest currency of all. So as the days unfolded, Ava watched, waited, and prepared. Because whether Cody was a liar, a lover, or something in between, the game had changed. And this time, Ava would not be caught off guard. Not by another man. Not by another illusion. Not ever again. Willow stepped into the aisle bathed in the late afternoon glow of Port Charles, her veil trailing behind her like a whisper of hope. And for a moment it seemed as if every eye in attendance shared her belief that this day would be the beginning of a happy, healed future. But beneath the pristine silk layers and the carefully practiced smile lay a turbulent sea of doubt, an undercurrent that had begun subtly, then surged with force as rumors of Nina and Drew's affair began to curl through the reception halls like smoke. What was meant to be a sacred unity of two people became a stage for disruption. As whispers of betrayal grew louder, and the world Willow trusted began to crumble. With each step she took toward the altar, a shift occurred, not in the flowers or the music, but in the atmosphere of her world. The crystalline silence of the sanctuary was pierced by a collective intake of breath. A barely audible murmur that carried the weight of everything she had believed in, loyalty, trust, love untainted by deception. But behind the veil of matrimonial bliss, threaded through with family ties, tradition, and future promises, arrived the revelation that threatened to unravel her sense of self entirely. The magnitude of the affair, hidden, intimate, consensual, slithered into every corner of her mind. They say the biggest heartbreak happens not when you learn the truth, but when you realize you were never trusting someone who deserved it. For Willow, that realization came not with confrontation or overt drama, but with a hush that fell over the congregation as the first details emerged. Drew and Nina had been more than blurred glances and late-night phone calls. They had a shared history of intimacy, a clandestine relationship that had been cultivated in secrecy, nourished by mutual need, and ultimately disguised as nothing more than friendship. All at once, every smile and every borrowed glance took on new meaning. The invitations printed with her name. The guests seated in hushed anticipation, it all felt fraudulent. Even the floral arrangements seemed to mock her with their delicate beauty. As though nature itself was celebrating a future that no longer existed. Willow began to understand that what she had thought of as foundation was actually the storm's first whisper. No one offered an explanation. No one made an announcement. That would have been too loud. Instead, knowledge spread like poison. Drew's mother felt the tremor beneath her feet, but dared not speak. His best man's pale expression revealed more than words could convey. Nina didn't turn her head, but Willow felt the electricity that crackled when their gazes passed. The facade had shattered. And all that remained was the sharp, menacing reflection of betrayal. And so Willow continued her walk. Step by step. 1 mile at a time, only in her mind. Because at that threshold, she stopped believing in anything she had once thought solid. Her promise to love, to honor, to cherish, felt exposed in its fragility. It was a vow offered to a man who had already decided to keep half the truth hidden. She realized there was no peace in staying. There was no real future built on shifting sands. The world she had entered as a bride was now one in which every portal revealed another lie. In that stillness, that final step before the altar, Willow had a moment of pure clarity. She looked at the sea of faces, family angel-faced amid deception, friends silent in their discomfort, and realized they were all witnesses to a facade she could no longer perpetuate. To remain would require a courage she didn't possess, not yet. She would have to bury her soul under layers of pretending, to carry a secret like a wound sealed only by silence. The only sanctuary she instinctively craved at that moment was distance, from home, from Drew, from even herself. So with steady resolve, she paused. She did not embrace abbreviations like composure or resilience. She moved beyond them. She looked across the aisle and saw the man she thought she loved, dressed in the suit she chose. Under the flowers she just arranged, and she knew she could not say his name. She turned away, guiding herself not down the aisle toward him, but back out into the light that had once ignited in her heart. Then, in a breath that was both a release and a rebirth, she walked backward out of the sanctuary, the chapel echoing her departure. And everyone held their breath. In that moment, time fractured. What came after was cacophony, Drew's gasp, Nina's wide eyes, shocked murmurs rippling across the pews. But Willow felt none of it. She was already out the door, already far ahead of everyone else, navigating the weight of truth with only her own footsteps guiding her. She left all the history, all the architecture, all the expectations behind, and in the rawness of that exit, she found an unspoken power. Because the real shift wasn't her departure, it was her awakening. At that threshold, Willow had proven something profound, that sometimes the most radical act of change comes not from constructing a life around broken promises, but from stepping boldly away from them. She didn't just say no to Drew. She said yes to her own clarity, her own unfinished journey, the life no longer scripted by a story that had lost its meaning. As she walked into the afternoon haze, the world shifted around her. The future she believed in, safe, predictable, comforting, fell away in favor of a future redefined by truth. She did not yet see the full path ahead. She did not yet know where the journey would take her, or how the pieces would fall. But she was stepping forward, guided no longer by love's illusion, but by a deeper current. The courage to acknowledge betrayal, and the determination to choose herself first. And that, Willow realized, was the grandest change of all, not the collapse of a wedding, but the collapse of pretense. Amid all the shifting tides in Port Charles, that was the one adjustment resonating with real power, the moment she reclaimed her voice, her choice, and her dignity. That was true love, if not for another person, then for herself, and nothing else would ever be the same again. Michael stood beneath the faded light of the Quartermain terrace. The chill of the evening air brushing against his skin as if it, too, understood the hollowness rising in his chest. Below, the grounds were serene, but nothing about his thoughts mirrored that calm. The wedding was over. Willow had stood at the altar beside Drew, and the vows that once belonged in Michael's dreams had now been spoken between two people who were no longer him and her. The applause, the music, the polite congratulations, they had all sounded muffled in his ears, as if the world itself had gone underwater. Now, alone with Christina. Michael found the courage to speak the words that had been buried beneath his carefully composed exterior, his grief a slow, unbearable leak that no dam of resolve could hold forever. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even bitter. What filled him now was something worse, a quiet devastation, like the hollow ache left in a home where laughter once lived. He told Christina how strange it felt to watch someone who had once been his entire world build a life with someone else. How even the sight of her smiling across the aisle at Drew had sliced something open inside him. He tried to explain how he'd rehearsed it in his head, that he'd told himself this day would come. That he'd pretended he was strong enough to face it. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of Wiley waving at her in the pews. Or the way Amelia had reached out for a woman who now belonged to another family. That was what hurt most, not that Willow had moved on, but that his children had quietly lost their mother. And no one seemed to notice except him. He recounted how Willow used to write bedtime messages on Wiley's whiteboard when she missed tucking him in. How she'd once brought every ounce of gentleness and fire to building a safe life for them. He remembered her hands trembling when Amelia was born. The fierce protectiveness in her eyes when Wiley had his first asthma scare. She was the center of their world. And now, she had walked away, not just from him, but from that version of herself. He couldn't blame her for wanting happiness. He couldn't ask her to stay in the shadows of pain. But it didn't make the absence any less crushing. Christina listened without judgment. Her presence a quiet comfort, her silence permission for him to be raw. Michael admitted the guilt he carried. Guilt for not fighting harder. Guilt for the resentment he still felt toward Drew. Despite trying to bury it. Guilt that his love hadn't been enough. He had stepped aside, given Willow space, supported her healing, thinking she would find her way back. But the door had closed. She had chosen a different path. And now he was left picking up the pieces of a future that would never exist. He confessed how he feared the emotional gaps his children would inherit. How one day Wiley might ask why Willow didn't stay. How Amelia might never remember the scent of her hair or the softness of her voice. He worried about the unspoken questions they would carry. The quiet sadness of a mother lost not to death, but to distance. He feared that no amount of storytelling could recreate what they had lost. And worse. He feared they would eventually forget how much she had once meant to them. Christina's eyes filled with compassion, but she didn't offer empty comfort. She didn't tell him to move on or remind him of the blessings he still had. She simply acknowledged his pain, bore witness to the depth of his loss. Because it wasn't just heartbreak. It was something deeper, a fracture in the foundation of what he had believed family could be. Michael found himself drifting into silence again, eyes locked on the dark horizon. He thought about how Drew had stood there beside Willow, proud and certain, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the storm brewing inside the man who had once held her through every night of her recovery. He thought about how life could change in slow increments, and then all at once. One day, Willow had needed him. The next, she belonged to someone else. And no ceremony could erase the ache that truth left behind. The hardest part wasn't watching her marry Drew. The hardest part was knowing that even as she walked towards someone else, a piece of her still lived in his memory, in the lullabies she sang, in the meals they cooked, in the quiet mornings before the rest of the world woke up. That kind of intimacy didn't vanish. It just lingered in places where it could no longer be reached. As the night deepened and the stars emerged overhead, Michael whispered to Christina that he would survive. Because that's what people did. They survived. But he knew something inside him had shifted. A chapter had closed. A story had ended. And while Willow walked into a new beginning, he remained in the pages they had left behind, reading, remembering, and learning how to let go. Lucy had always been a master strategist beneath her eccentric energy. And when she extended the invitation to Lois, it wasn't just a gesture of camaraderie, it was a declaration of war against the tightening grip that Tracy had been exerting over deception and the lives orbiting the Quartermain Empire. For Lois, the invitation didn't just come as a surprise, it was an affirmation that her voice still mattered, that her fire hadn't been extinguished by years of absence or regret. The two women had their differences in the past, but what united them now was far more potent than what had ever divided them, a shared disdain for the manipulative, unyielding force that was Tracy. And the growing need to reclaim the spaces she had dominated for far too long. Lois, energized by Lucy's bold plan, felt a surge of purpose she hadn't felt since her earlier days of fierce independence and unapologetic loyalty. The alliance, however, wasn't just about vengeance. It was about re-establishing autonomy, about proving to themselves and everyone else that they were not disposable, not relics of a past generation. Tracy had underestimated them, believing their moments of weakness or vulnerability had disqualified them from power. But Lucy's invitation confirmed what Lois had long felt burning inside her, that there was still a fight worth engaging in, and that together they could challenge even the most cemented Quartermain schemes. As plans began to form, Lois found herself slipping effortlessly into the rhythm of strategy and rebellion. Her instincts sharper than ever. She didn't just want to defend what was hers, she wanted to expose everything Tracy had corrupted. And Lucy's invitation was the first step toward igniting a storyline that would shake the foundation of Port Charles. But the alliance wasn't just tactical, it was also deeply personal. Lois had seen what Tracy's manipulations had done to Brooke Lynn, to Ned, to the people she still loved fiercely. Joining forces with Lucy was more than rebellion, it was retribution cloaked in empowerment. And in a town where loyalty was currency and betrayal was sport, this newfound partnership was bound to draw blood. The mere existence of their coalition introduced a chaos that couldn't be contained. Because once Lois accepted Lucy's offer, it wasn't just a power shift, it was a signal to every corner of Port Charles that the old guard no longer had the final say. And as secrets threatened to surface and alliances started to crumble, it became clear that this was the beginning of a wild new chapter, one that would drag Tracy out from the shadows and force every player to choose a side.